much for being here this evening. This is our fourth event of the 5 events in 5 towns in the book. And first I want to thank Galina, the librarian here in Harrison. She's always incredible to work with. And I want to start this evening. It's different for us because we have the honor this time of working with the Marin High School students who responded to this particular event tonight by creating their own art. Their prompt was to use their art to express their ideas on social justice. So we have 3 beautiful pieces over here, which I hope you can look at as you go out. They are on the table here by Riley Rhodes. Her piece is called After I Said No. And Riley's here this evening. Thanks for being here. We have a beautiful piece by Nora Ford. I don't know the name of it, but everything is explained in their words. And then Zoe Abramidis, she has My Body, My Choice, which is the pink piece in the back. And we're going to show 2 short films. They're under 3 minutes. So we'll do that now. The first one is by Melina Silvestro. It's called Transcendence. And then we will see one by I'm forgetting who we have here, Alexa Latzman, which is called Gender Inequality. So we'll watch those real quick, and I'll give one more announcement. Thank you.
It's 2 very clear sides, 2 separate options, 2 paths to take. When you're born, you're assigned a word, girl or boy. You hear girl, and instantly you imagine putting bows in her hair, you paint the baby's room pink, and buy pink onesies. You hear boy, and you imagine years of sports games. You paint the nursery blue and buy little onesies with dinosaurs and train prints on them. Girl or boy, and that's it.
Life is full of adventures. Always have hope in your heart and just try and be as true to yourself as possible.
Curiosity in our society is promoted. It's encouraged. Only 5% of our oceans have been explored. There's so much more to discover, so much more to experience if we look beyond what we already see.
Be proud of who you are. There are so many wonderful, diverse people in the world.
There's this line of respect that people tend to cross, often unintentionally.
And now it's my time to relax. I usually go over the accounts and bills, upkeep on the house and car, electricity, gas, and all the rest.
For Mrs. Housewife, all sorts of wonders are heard.
Let's transcend the lines that have been drawn for us.
I'm Ava Becker. My name is Sarah.
My name is Emma Cringdon, and I'm a senior at Mamaroneck High School. I do believe that gender inequality is still a really big problem today. It's not as serious as it used to be in like the 1900s because like women are actually like allowed to vote now, but it's still like a really big issue, especially like money and like the economy. Like there's still a big pay gap where I believe the fact is it's like around 82 cents a woman earns, a man earns $1.
I also was so against the color pink. Like if anyone asked me if I liked the color pink, I was offended because again, pink was girly and girly was bad.
Gender inequality is an issue for both genders. I mean, women definitely have their struggles, but I'm not being like insensitive towards men also. I think there's also things that they go through too. A really big part about this whole movement and like this whole gender inequality thing is to not neglect a side. And we're highlighting the side that women need to be like equalized like with men, with everything, but we can't also neglect the masculine side and like the men involved. And we can't do that. We need to make sure that it's equal. We need to do and define the word equal.
to thank Letty Pinto for organizing this for us. She was the catalyst between CURE and the students, and Meg Purvis from the high school. She's a teacher. I'm Nicole Belafonte, by the way. I'm one of the founders and the president of CURE. And before, so I'm so excited tonight to have Devin Sandiford and CJ Farley and Alvin Clayton, and our incredible moderators, Leslie Gaskin, Candace Pinn, and Ann Lobu. I'm going to read Leslie, Candace, and Ann's bios really quickly because they are just amazing, and I had to cut them. So Candace Pinn is an educational consultant and retired educator with 30 years of experience. She provides diversity, equity, and inclusion training to educators and school-related personnel in public and private educational settings. Candace became a master early childhood educator, utilizing her strong foundation in the pragmatics and fundamentals of teaching while enjoying many leadership roles over her career. Culturally responsive education, staff developer trainer, Federation of United School Employees, representative, mentor, teacher, teacher leader, and chairperson representative of district-wide committees on diversity, equity, and inclusion, curriculum and instruction, response to intervention, RTI, and nutrition. After becoming a member in 2006 of the Westchester Alliance of Black School Educators, Candace was elected president and has served in this capacity for 10 years. Candace is a native of Brooklyn, New York. She holds a BS in General Engineering from Tufts University, an MS in Computer Science from NYU College of Engineering, an MA in Education from Columbia Teachers College. She has 4 adult children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. She and her husband reside in Mount Vernon. Ann Lobu serves as chair of the board of the Coalition of Understanding Racism for Education, that's us. Ann served 2 terms on the Board of Education for the Mamaroneck School District, including 2 years as president. She is the senior research strategist for the Black Education Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. That's right? Okay. Got it. She has led the board of Jacob Reese Neighborhood Settlement House, a community-based social services organization located in Long Island City, Queens, for 6 years. Ann is a doctoral student in the Education Policy Program at Teachers College, Columbia U. Her research interests include school and district leadership for equity. Ann has an MA in Education Policy from Teachers College, an MPhil from Oxford University, and a BA from Cornell University. She lives in Westchester with her husband. Last but certainly not least, Leslie Gaskin. She has been involved in organizations that seek to support, organize, and empower Black community in New Rochelle, New York since she was a teenager. A founding member of Ki Africa Tali Mushule, a Saturday school which offered an Afrocentric curriculum to students. A founding member of the African Heritage Educational Forum lecture series that featured guests like Dr. John Henrik Clark and Dr. Yosef Ben Jakanen. Yeah. Leslie is a member of New Roar, New Rochelle Against Racism. She's a member of the New Rochelle branch of the NAACP. She's a member of The Collective, a group whose mission is to advocate for melanated children. Leslie is also a member of NRAJ, New Rochelle Alliance for Justice, and the Lincoln Attendance Zone, PTSA. Leslie is the Carrington Arms Tenants Council President, and finally, Leslie is a charter member of the African American Advisory Committee of the City of New Rochelle. That's Leslie Gaskin. So I will let my incredible moderators take over. Thank you.
Sure, I think our first job is to introduce our panelists, who are the real stars of the show tonight. So I have the honor of introducing Alvin Clayton. He's a Trinidad-born artist, restaurateur, and model. Alvin and his wife Gwen are the owners and operators of the award-winning Southern and Caribbean restaurant Alvin and Friends in New Rochelle, New York. Alvin Clayton is a self-taught artist. He is heavily influenced by Matisse and the French Impressionist movement. His paintings exude bright, bold colors of life in the African experience as it relates to the past and present conditions. Alvin has had several group and one-man shows featuring his work, most recently, Alvin and Friends at the Rye Art Center in Rye, New York, and Unapologetically Me, a virtual political show at Iona College's Brother Kenneth Gallery. Gaining status as a supermodel, Alvin Alvin's modeling career started at Wilhelmina Models and ended with the Ford Modeling Agency just 8 years ago. As a model, he has graced the pages of the top publications such as GQ, Vogue, Glamour, Elle, Ebony Essence, EM, to name a few. With a well-rounded resume, Alvin has now been signed by the world-renowned IMG Models. Alvin and Gwen live in Westchester as partners in the restaurant. They have 4 kids and a dog and 2 cats.
So I have the pleasure of introducing Devin Sandiford, who's not next to me, but at the end. So Devin Sandiford is a published writer, award-winning storyteller, and founder of Unreeling Storytelling, a Brooklyn-based community providing space for people who quietly wait to speak and yet urgently need to be heard. Raised in the wake of his Uncle Ron being fatally shot by the police outside of their Miami home, Devin spent his childhood and young adult years carrying his uncle's death in silence everywhere he went. Then, feeling a voice within that was longing to be heard, Devin moved to Brooklyn, New York to push himself out of his comfort zone and find the power of his authentic voice, stepping onto stages in New York City, New Jersey, Toronto, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Michigan, Virginia, and virtually all over the world. Devin has now shared more than 50 personal stories in front of sold-out crowds of up to 1,200 people. His stories have been featured in the Washington Post, the Moth Podcast, and Radio Hour, Seattle NPR affiliate KNKX, Speak Up Storytelling, Simple Families Podcast, Writing Class Radio, and many other outlets. Devin has also been interviewed about race and identity, parenting, storytelling, and grief for the New York Times and Washington Post. Devin works as a senior communications officer, story developer, and writer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife and their 11 and 8-year-old sons. He is working on his debut book, a memoir, currently titled The Silence We Carry, Confessions of a 6-Year-Old Man.
And I'm going to introduce you to C.J. Farley. His young adult novel, Around Harvard Square, won an NAACP Image Award in 2020. He's the author of 4 other novels, including Game World, My Favorite War, Kingston by Starlight, and his most recent release, 0 O'Clock. Farley's nonfiction books include Before the Legend, The Rise of Bob Marley, which was a finalist for a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the national bestseller, Aaliyah, More Than a Woman, which was adopted into a hit movie for Lifetime Television. Farley co-wrote and co-edited the book The Blues, the companion volume to Martin Scorsese's PBS documentary series, and served as a consulting producer on the Peabody-winning HBO documentary Mr. Dynamite, The Rise of James Brown. Farley, a former senior editor for the Wall Street Journal and a former music critic for Time magazine, has interviewed some of the greatest musical artists in the world, including Aretha Franklin, Bob Dylan, Stevie Wonder, Joni Mitchell, Lauryn Hill, Adele, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Janelle Monáe, and Taylor Swift. Farley is a graduate of Harvard and a former editor of the Harvard Lampoon.
So before I read the first question, I want to remind the audience that the full biographies, right, of our panelists is on the website, Cure? Yes. And that this series is based on Dr. Soyika Diggs Colbert's Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, which your moderators have all read, okay? So I will start with the first question. It's actually for each of you to introduce some of your work. So can you each tell us a bit about yourselves from the beginning, and how you came to have the careers that you have. Want to start?
Might as well. First, good evening, everyone, and honored to be here, honored to be joined by the panelists. And my name is Alvin Clayton, and I was born in Trinidad, came to the United States my sophomore year of high school in Washington, D.C., Archbishop John Carroll High School. Coming from Trinidad, soccer was the sport that we played, so it was very easy for me to have a bit of an advantage as a soccer player. So thus, I used those skills, and I was awarded a full scholarship to Mount St. Mary's University, where I was a goalkeeper. Got drafted by San Diego after college. However, the NASL, which was the Outdoor Soccer League at the time, there weren't enough fan support. I always say to people I was born 10 years too early. So the NASL folded. One of my college friends was a model at Wilhelmina Modeling Agency, and always thought that I could probably be a model, but I wasn't really interested. And I had a degree in secondary English education and psychology. I wanted to be a guidance counselor in high school, believe it or not. Anyways, after the soccer thing panned it out because the NASL folded, I asked my friend if he thought that I'd be interested, if his agency would be interested in getting me. He said yes. I came to New York. Wilhelmina told me how difficult it was for models of color, and but they said that they would give me a try, and it worked out. So I started that. So that was my first career as a model. I was fortunate enough to be one of the first African American model to have 8 full pages in GQ magazine when I started, and that kind of like kickstarted my career. The restaurant career came about because one of the young ladies that I worked with as a model, I had been about 15 years into the modeling industry when she asked me what I would do after modeling, and I said, being off the regular workforce, I probably would have to create something for myself. I said I knew how to cook. I learned cooking from my grandmother. I worked as a waiter when I first started as modeling, so I said I'd probably do a restaurant. So happens that her boyfriend was a restaurateur, Brad Johnson, and his father had owned a cellar in Manhattan. He'd owned the Roxbury Club in LA. And I met Brad, and he said, I'm in the process of doing a new restaurant. He took a liking to me and asked me if I wanted to invest. Turns out that I did invest with them, and some of the investors of that restaurant were Denzel Washington, Eddie Murphy, and so it became this huge celebrity thing. I learned back of the house from Brad. So that's how I got my restaurant footing. As for the art, coming from Caribbean parents, you couldn't tell your parents you wanted to be an artist. That was a no-no. So as a kid, I always loved drawing, and that passion was always there. I was on assignment in Paris, and I just fell in love with Matisse's paintings. And so for like 8 months, I just copied Matisse paintings. Because I could draw, there was a simplicity to his work that I felt that I could replicate. So I did that. And I painted for like 2 years, never showed anyone any of my paintings. One of my agents came to my loft on 10th Street and 2nd Avenue, and it was adorned with paintings. And she said, I have to have a friend of mine that has a gallery in Soho see your work. So she came over, Lee Arthur, and she's like, I've got to give you a show. So she gave me a show. 2 months later, after meeting me, we showed 27 pieces. We sold 19 pieces at the show. And Elsa Clinch was doing CNN House of Style at the time, and she was doing a segment on successful models, and I was one of her features, and the show was up at Lee Arthur's gallery at the same time. So that was part of the story. And then I had people like from all over the world, because CNN goes all over the world, where can we buy your paintings? And that's how I became an artist. So I don't know if some of you saw the show back in the day, Living Color, and they had the Jamaican that has 100 jobs. That was me. So that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you. you want to be next?
Oh, yeah. I was actually also born abroad. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, but I left when I was a month old, so I have no accent. When I try to fake it, Jamaicans laugh at me, so I can't do that. But I grew up in Brockport, New York. Anyone know where Brockport is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, University of.
Yeah, my parents taught at the State University of New York at Brockport. Very small college, great great town, a lot of cows, a lot of deer these days. But the great thing about them teaching at the college, my dad was an economist and my mother was a professor of African American studies, and so that helped color my worldview between those two disciplines. But they used to always bring interesting people to to my house, for dinner, to hang out, people who were speaking at the college. And when I was very young, younger than 10, I remember they brought Gwendolyn Brooks by the house. Gwendolyn Brooks has a lot in common with Lorraine Hansberry in that she was a breakthrough artist. She was actually the first African-American man or woman to win the Pulitzer Prize, and she won it for poetry. And so when she came to our house, I couldn't quite believe that this woman who I looked her up in the encyclopedia, this is way before Wikipedia, an actual encyclopedia. I'm like, there she is under B, then she's sitting here in our living room, and she's actually in the encyclopedia. This is crazy that all these poets and writers that I love actually exist. They actually can come into your living room. And so that helped inspire me to realize, it can be real. You can go out into the wider world and actually become a writer or an artist. So having Gwendolyn Brooks really in my house actually inspired me later to go on to Harvard and try to pursue my career as a writer. And when I got to Harvard, there's a place called the Harvard Lampoon. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a leading humor magazine. It's a very kind of clubby place, or so I thought. But they created a whole lot of really great writers who were launched there. And everyone from John Updike to Conan O'Brien to like every writer for Saturday Night Live was on the Harvard Lampoon. But there wasn't a whole lot of diversity on the staff. And so I really wanted to join, but I thought they really let me on because it's a bunch of non-black people, mostly guys. I would like to have access to the resources and to be part of that tradition, but are they really going to judge me by the quality of my work? Luckily, one of my roommates, who was Korean American, told me, let's go integrate this place. Let's just do it. And so we both did it together. We both sort of fought together. We both sweated it out. He was an artist. I was a writer. We did some collaborative work. And we both got on the staff. And it really, something that really helped my career because someone else on the Lampoon helped me find an agent. I published my first book and ended up becoming a writer for Time magazine and then for the Wall Street Journal, an editor for there. And so that's kind of my path to where I am now as a writer and an editor, and I'm also executive editor at Audible, the audiobook company.
Thank you.
Yeah, what's great is the sequence that we're going in and the trend. My family's also from the Caribbean, and I'm the next generation removed, so I was born in the States. Obviously have no accent and a lot of distance from, my mom's from Trinidad and my dad's from Barbados. So my family, they didn't explicitly say it, but very religious family. So the idea of going into the arts wasn't something as much as like helping people. A lot of people from where I'm from and my family are in the health field, either nurses or doctors. If not that, then you can become a teacher. And neither of those actually appealed to me at all. So I really loved math. I went into engineering, and for 15 years, that was like my profession. Worked in technology, worked at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And it wasn't until my wife got into a graduate program in Maryland that I got away from my family a bit and started to like see the portions of myself that it had been existing like quietly. And something that had happened when I was little, my uncle being shot, started to kind of like bubble up a little bit. And so after moving to Maryland and moving to Brooklyn, I decided I wanted to write. I used to love to write when I was little. Like I would write poems all the time. I actually had a piece that was published in this magazine. I remember getting $50 when I was 13 and thinking this is the greatest thing ever, but I didn't think that you could do that for a profession. So when we moved to Brooklyn, I got back into writing, but I found myself like all those years in between struggling through writing and finding all the time, like just looking for synonyms, trying to get this one piece just perfect. And I must have spent like a year, if not 18 months on this one piece. And everywhere I was sending it out, like it was getting rejected all over. And I was just like, oh, this is a lot harder than I remember it. And so I was really frustrated. I was actually headed to Manhattan from Brooklyn for my son's jiu-jitsu, and I was like, I'm just gonna write something in the notes on my phone. I don't care what it is, just anything other than this piece. So it was a 30-minute train ride, 30 minutes there, 30 minutes back. When I got home, I put it into a document and I sent it out almost right away. It got picked up by a publication, this small publication called Writing Class Radio, and then a short time after it got picked up in the Washington Post. And it was like the indication for me that I'd been spending so much time trying to like perfect this thing, and people didn't really need perfect. They just needed me to be honest. And when I had that experience, I wanted to replicate it, and I actually was mentioning to a friend, like, maybe one day I'll go to like the Moth, and she's like, you should just go tomorrow. Just find whenever the next one is and just do it. And I like took that as a challenge and found the next one, went. Turns out it was like an open mic, but like so many people had put their names into the bag that I didn't get my name called, and I was like kind of glad because I wasn't prepared at all, didn't know what it was. So I went to the next one, prepared a little bit, and when I got on the stage, shared a moment from my life just like openly and honestly, and I could just feel like myself like lifting up and opening up, and it was like this powerful feeling, which was like a gift and a curse, because the moment that I got honest on the stage, all the moments that I'd been pushing down about my uncle and about this predominantly white town that I grew up in, and there was a lot of racism started to bubble up, and I saw the ways that I was like hurting my sons in my silence, and it became a call for me to find all the things that I had hidden away, bring them to the surface, and reshift the narrative in a way that was like not just about the trauma or something that was bad, but really thinking about it in the ways in which I can rewrite the narrative as a writer. So that's how I got into the arts for me.
So those are really fantastic stories and so inspiring to me. I mean, I think, gosh, if only I'd taken more chances in my life, I could, you know, I wish I could be like these folks. So I have the good fortune of being able to ask you each to share an example of your work so that we can get to know you as artists a little better. And I think I'm going to start in the middle with CJ and then go to Alvin and then go to Devin.
Okay, well, I'm going to read from this book, 0 O'Clock, which is my most recent book. It's actually told from the perspective of a teenage Jamaican-American girl, so you'll have to use your imagination since I'm going to read it. So I'm going to read from near the end of the book, and it's a book about a girl who is living through the pandemic in New Rochelle, which, as you may remember, was the epicenter at one point. And one reason I wrote this book is because I felt like, especially during like the 2 years at the height of the pandemic, it felt like we were living this sort of weird dream where once we woke up, we wouldn't remember how weird it was. You ever have a dream like that? We're like, why was I riding that lizard? What was going on? And then 5 minutes later, you're like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. So I wrote this actually during the pandemic, actually was going on in real time because I wanted to make sure I captured how weird it was before we all sort of woke up. So this is near the end of the book where the protagonist is sort of going for a run and sort of reflecting back on what she's just been through. There are powers in this world that pit us against each other. They have us fighting for scraps, for jobs, for college admissions, for toilet paper, for Instacart delivery slots, for bat soup. But it's a lie. We don't have to fight each other. The best things in life, the things we really need, they're not scarce. They're infinite, like love. A parent can have a dozen kids, and there's always enough love. You can have 1 million friends, or 2, and there's always enough love. You can marry once and get married again, and there's always enough love. You can love anyone of any sex or any race, and there's always enough love. The government always says they have no money, but the minute they wanted to come up with trillions in pandemic relief, they came up with it. The things that really matter aren't fossil fuels that run dry. They're like sun and wind and love, and they never run short or run out. They're like loaves and fishes. There's enough for the multitudes. I want you to know, Dad, that I'm not angry anymore. I'm not scared anymore. I signed up for that trial online. If they take 16-year-olds, I'm going to do it. I don't care how dangerous and dumb it is. I'm helping to organize more protests against police brutality and wealth inequality and presidential mendacity, and I'm going to keep on speaking out no matter what they throw at us. I'm probably always going to have OCD and depression and all the other issues I have to deal with, but that's just life. Other people have it worse. There's always someone who has it worse. It's like they said at the end of that book I read for school. I have no idea what's coming, but there are sick people who need saving. I'm doing something that's better than anything I've ever done, and that feels right. I want you to know that I know what you're trying to tell me with your life, with your death. It's crazy that it took a virus to get the message home to me, but how many plagues did God have to throw at Pharaoh before the guy realized he had to let Moses and his people go? The things that mattered before, they don't matter as much anymore. I want to do well at college, make some good money, I won't lie about that. But now I know that all that stuff can fall away and none of it matters. I can be alone in my house with my family and no job and no schedule and no nothing and be as happy as I've ever been in my whole life. Loaves and fishes. You always have everything we need because living is giving. I close my eyes and listen to a breeze in the tree branches above my head. I was floating in a warm salt lake. When I opened my eyes, I noticed a stream full of fish flowing at the edge of the graveyard. I didn't have a flower to leave, so I planted a warm kiss on my father's cold headstone, jumped the iron fence, and went running up North Avenue back to my life. Even we have nothing, we have something to give.
You can just rip it off. Yeah. It's the right way.
Yeah. I just
So-
wish everybody could see it.
I think for me, as an artist, you just have to be true to yourself, and things that affect you in a certain way are the things that I paint about. For a very long time, I painted just simple, beautiful things, which to me, in a way, were kind of like political statements, because I painted black families, mother, father, because a lot of times I think the way that the media tends to portray us are not the way that we see ourselves and the way that we live on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the neighborhood that I live in, almost everybody has a mother, father in the household, taking care of their kids or whatever. And so when the media wasn't portraying that as the way that black people live, I felt that I had to paint that. So even though I may have painted a father and a mother at the table with their children having lunch or whatever, that was my political statement saying, yes, we have whole families as well. And for me anyways, I keep getting into these situations where, you confront racism or whatever, and I question myself. I'm like, how did this come to be? And it seems so absurd to me, racism. You tend to live the world through your own eyes, so I can't really figure it because I'm not a racist person at all. And so this piece that I have, it's called Absurdity of Racism. And what I was thinking at the time when I did this piece was like, black people in this country, they worked the fields and they made a lot of people very wealthy. These same people took care of these white people's babies. There's another painting that I have, it's called The Wet Nurse, where a black woman was actually forced to feed a white baby if she had a child at the same time as the parents. And I was thinking this, and it's like, as crazy and as amazing as that is, this person will still turn back and be racist to this person. You can't drink from this fountain. Breastfeeding somebody is probably one of the most intimate things that you can ever do. And after that, that person can drink at a fountain. So I was seeing what is the absurdity of this, right? And I was raised Catholic, and the story of Adam and Eve is we were all very innocent and naked in the Garden of Eden until we committed that sin. And once you committed the sin, you realized that you were no longer, you were naked and now you needed to be clothed. So the significance of this painting and the tree in the back, it's an apple tree, and the parents of these children, they've eaten from the tree of racism, so they're clothed. The children are still innocent and they love this person that's taking care of them. And so there's no racism there, so they're not even aware that they're naked. And so that's the significance of the painting. And it's just like the different things that goes through my head when I'm trying to think of it. And how can I make this painting be something that's attractive in one way where you look at it, but once you kind of go into undertones of what it is, there's a much deeper message to it. And I think if you come at somebody and you start screaming obscenities, they're very much, they want to run away from you. So what I try to do with my art is, even though I have a statement to make, I try to come from it a place of caring, a place where at least a conversation can be had. So that's what I try to do with my art.
Devin.
And Devin.
Yeah, first of all, really appreciate both of what you shared. I think the undertones is a place that I find myself often as well. The lower frequencies that we use when we have conversations. And though my book, I'll read a little excerpt of my work in progress memoir, does have trauma and racism in it. It's not about trauma or racism. It goes much beyond that to, I think, probably what I would best describe as like grief and sorrow, and the idea of how we can look at grief and sorrow and find things that are surprising when we are like willing to face them. So I'm gonna read a portion of this chapter. It's called Somewhere in a Memory. For as long as I can remember, I've only pictured my Uncle Ron one way. He's lying face down on the ground in front of my grandparents' house. His body is perfectly still, moments after he's been shot. As I look up from my uncle's motionless body, I see my mother. She's in a small white space wearing a bright red dress. Her back is leaning against the wall, eyes shut, head hanging, body trembling. She looks sad or afraid. Maybe she's both. It feels like I'm watching the scene from close and afar. Close enough to see his light go out and her body collapse, but too far for anyone to see that I am there. In reality, I wasn't there. The image I see of my uncle and mom is not from my memory, and it's certainly not from a dream. It might sound like a nightmare, but it was a vision. A vision I've had since I was 6 years old, and one that I've never been able to shake. A vision I know is close to the truth, because in South Miami Heights, Florida, in the spring of 1991, Ronald Edwards, my mom's youngest brother, my uncle, was shot and killed by the police in the front yard of my grandparents' house. He was 27 years old when he was killed, and my mom was 33 when she watched. I was 6, and even though I wasn't there and nobody in my family ever talked about what happened, my vision of the incident is as unshakable as the concrete that led to my grandparents' front door, as steadfast as the fence that separated their house from ours, and as persistent as the smell of coconut cookies that used to constantly drift out of my grandma's kitchen. And as terrifying as it is to picture my uncle dead outside of my childhood home, it is the memories that are fading from me that scare me the most. I know that I was the youngest living family member, and that it makes sense for me to have forgotten some things. I know that after the incident, my family and I moved away from our home in Miami, all the way across the country to California, making it understandable that I've left some memories behind. I also know that I knew my uncle, and that losing him in body and memory has felt like I've lost a part of myself. And no matter how many times I try and move on, the vision of his lifeless body always returns to my mind, urging me to look again. And sitting in my apartment 29 years after his death with children of my own, I find myself searching through all my early childhood memories, desperate to see a glimpse of my uncle while he was alive, or to reclaim the link between us that has gotten lost somewhere in a memory. Thank you.
My question to our esteemed creators reflects on what Colbert has written. She said that, or she noted that shadows that loomed throughout Hansberry's life cast large impressions. Each March 10th established a loss: her father, her anonymity, her marriage, that would serve as an essential moment to her becoming free. Can you share an essential moment from your own life that has had career-defining significance? Anyone would like to answer?
I know for me, as an artist, the incident that has changed me forever and changed my art was the George Floyd incident. And, you know, looking at that unfold on television just kind of like forced me to kind of dig deep about who I was as a person. And, you know, my whole being is one to, my personality is one to please and not to create friction in life. But after that incident, I just had this awakening that, you know, my feelings matters just as much as anybody else's feelings as well. And, you know, at that point, I know that there's no soft way to say this. I mean, we all deal with racism in this country, and I think part of it is we don't really talk about it enough. And, you know, we try to sugarcoat things a lot because we don't want to offend. And it's very easy when you're a black person and you have something to say that may not go over easily to be seen as the angry black man or the angry black woman. So I think a lot of times in order to get along in this society, we tend to kind of like be very measured with the words that we choose. I mean, you know, I was this guy that if I walked in Manhattan and I knew that a white person would be offended because a big black guy is walking behind them, I would walk to the side so as not to frighten that person. But after the George Floyd incident, I just said, why am I carrying this burden? You know, I'm not trying to rob anybody. I'm just walking on the street. So if you're offended or if you're frightened by me just walking behind you, I should not be, that's your burden. You have to figure out why you feel that way when I have nothing else to do except to walk in the street. So I think that was my coming out, and the virtual show that I did, Unapologetically Me, was based on that, and was based on the political happenings that was going on at the time and how I felt personally about it. And, you know, having a restaurant, I have to be very careful as well because I have people of all ilks that come into my restaurant. And I was always, like I said, very measured as not to offend. And at that point, I really didn't care anymore because, like I said, it was my feeling, and my feeling mattered at that moment. And so I think in my art now, every time I do something, I paint anything, there is that thought of what am I really trying to say and how am I going to say it without being apologetic for what I'm feeling. And so I think that was the defining moment for me in my career.
You know, for me, one of the defining moments in my career was really the birth of my kids. And I have two children, a son who's 20 in college, and a daughter who's 17 and who's in high school. And I used to write more adult books, biography on Bob Marley, a book about the Caribbean in the 18th century, a book about the Persian Gulf War. But when I had kids, I began to see really firsthand how few books are out there that are aimed at kids of color in terms of making them protagonists or making them really sort of serious players in the story, or that are written by or edited by people of color. There's a place called the Children's Cooperative Book Center that tracks these numbers, and it may seem, because we do see some authors make it on the Today Show or wherever else, that there are lots of books like that, but the numbers have remained relatively low and stable over the last couple of decades, and the number of books that are written by black authors for younger readers is actually way below the levels of black people in the population. And the ones that are out there are often about history topics, which could be great, or other things, and not really about their day-to-day experiences in a way that's uplifting or informative. So I wanted to write those kinds of books. But more than that, having kids, I think, really sort of helps deepen you as an artist. I remember I was at this one book festival where someone asked me, what is it like writing a book that has a protagonist, a young girl as a protagonist? Do you have to sort of simplify things? And I'm like, no, I got to make it more complex. I got to raise my game to actually pretend I'm a teenage girl, because all the teenage girls that I know are way more sophisticated about the world today, what's going on. They have deeper thoughts than me about the news. And so I'm always listening to what my daughter has to say or her friends have to say, because I learn a lot. For example, with 0 o'clock, my original title for the book was going to be Bat Soup, because I was sort of fascinated by the sort of racism of the fantasies people had about the origins of COVID. But then my friend from college, who I got in a lampoon with, called me and said, that's racist, don't call it Bat Soup. And so I thought, okay, maybe we'll call it that. And my daughter was listening to, of course, this band BTS, which at the time was sort of an up-and-coming band. And I'm like, K-pop, isn't that just, teen stuff? Is that really getting good? But she made playlists for me to listen to. I'm like, this is actually really sophisticated, smart, entertaining music. And I used to be a music critic for Time. I should have known better than that. But again, a teenage girl taught me what music was really worth listening to. And I began to see the depth in the music. I ended up calling the book 0 O'Clock, in part because this song by BTS was about how when the clock reaches 0, you always have an opportunity to sort of start again. And I felt it sort of captured that weird timelessness we all had during the pandemic, where we didn't know what time it was, or what day it was, or what year it was, because all of our normal markers of time had been sort of taken away. So it sort of fit perfectly for the title of the book. So I find having young kids, talking to them, really listening to what they have to say, respecting their opinions, letting them teach you rather than just the other way around, has really sort of helped me in terms of my sensitivity as a writer, in terms of the things I'm writing about, and just has sort of made me a better person in general.
Yeah, I think for me, similarly to CJ, having my sons was, I think, a big push for me. And between myself and maybe my wife and the Times, how they've been empowered to ask really challenging questions, I think has pushed me into spaces and to be very intentional. And I was probably the most memorable moment, my son, who's now 11, but was 7 at the time, we were in France for a month as a family vacationing, and we were having a really good time. We just got off of a boat river cruise, that one of our own private boats, and we got out of the boat, and my 7-year-old, I had my younger son on my shoulder, he was sleeping. My 7-year-old, he looked up at me and asked, why didn't you report those police? And I was just like, there's no police around, we're on vacation, why are you asking these questions? And I was I was gonna dive into context and really teach him a lesson. But he had asked that question before I knew what he was talking about, this incident that happened when I was 21, that I was surrounded by the police. And at the end of the incident, he would always ask me how come I didn't report the police, because when I went into the hotel where I was staying, all the hotel workers that knew me were like, do you want us to report this incident? We can't believe that just happened to you. And I was just like, no, I just want to go to my room and just be done with that. And my son would always ask me at the end of the story, why didn't you report them? And I had told him over and over again, just who would I report them to nothing would happen. Like, there's nothing I could have said that would have changed that. I just wanted to move on. And as we were like walking along the river that day, I had like a lot of extra time because my wife was actually looking around for a bathroom. And so I gave my son like this huge history lesson. It was like 45-minute conversation. We did like the whole enslavement, slave trade, segregation, busing. Like, it was a long conversation. He was asking me questions. We were going back and forth. And like at the end of the conversation, I was like, I did it. He's never gonna have to ask me that question again. It's done. And 2 weeks later, I got into a bus in the south of France to go pick up a rental car. And I didn't have any luggage or anything, so I just like pulled out my phone to start writing. It was like a crowded bus. And as I like started writing, I heard like these people speaking, and they were speaking in English. And we'd been in France for about a month, and like I hadn't heard anybody speaking in English for like a long time without an accent. So I looked up, and I saw it was like this family, this mom and dad with a little boy. They were holding in their arms, and the little boy looked just like his mom. He had like these bright blue eyes, and the dad was like really tall. And I looked, and I saw that the dad had the pocket of his backpack was open, and it had the passports there. And initially I was like, I don't want to help. I just want to like mind my own business and go about, like, I don't want this to be a thing. But then when I like thought about like, yeah, he's a father, I'm a father, like I don't want them to lose their passports. Like, I tapped him on the shoulder and was like your pocket's open. And I don't want you to drop your passports. And he like tried to do the whole father like shuffle with the kid in his arm, reaching around and like twisting. And I was just like, I could just get that for you. And I zipped it shut. And when I zipped it shut, his wife asked him, where's your wallet, honey? And I was just like, really? I was helping you out. And I was just like, whatever, I've had these experiences my whole life. I just want to move on. I'm going to go back to my phone to write. When I was going to do that, his wife leaned forward and like pretended to kiss him on the cheek, but then she whispered something in his ear. And I was like, I don't know what she whispered, but I know exactly what he's about to do. And like, sure enough, he put his son down on the seat in front of him, and he turned the backpack away from me into the crowd of people on the other side of him. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And so still trying to push it away and move on, like I had always done. I looked back to my phone, but when I looked back to my phone, I saw the little boy who was like maybe 3 or 4, and he had the deep blue eyes. They were like staring up at me. And I didn't know what he was thinking, but like something about the way he was looking made it seem like he was trying to figure out what was like so suspicious about me. And it occurred to me that that mom's whisper had had such an impact in his life and such an impact in my life. And I had been telling my son for like, since he was like 3 to the time he was like 7, that my words couldn't have changed anything about what had happened to me when I was 21. And it hit me really hard that like I'd been telling my own son that our words don't matter. And that moment for me propelled me into like really moving forward to think about the ways in which like our words do matter and can make impact. And just to take a moment longer, his younger brother asked me a very similar difficult question to watch a video when I was watching the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And initially I was just like, I didn't want to share it with him at all. And I think just going through this process of like me being around the same age they were, I was around 6 or 7 when Rodney King was beat and the riots were happening in LA. And just like the years that had passed, I was like, I need to share this with them in some type of way. And my son's teaching me about like when you share, what can happen and open up, and pushing me to talk to my mom. And to the point of Lorraine's every March 10, I finally built up the courage to talk to my mom about her brother. We had never spoken about, nobody in my family had ever talked about my uncle at all. And me and my mom ended up having a 3-hour conversation. It was the first time I'd ever seen my mom cry. She shared a ton about her life in the islands before, when her parents moved here and left them in the islands, and then them coming over, and came to a point where it was just like, she shared all this history with me about my family that I didn't know. And it was like a really moving conversation that was like another reminder about like facing the hard thing. And at the end of the conversation, I'd asked my mom about like where my grandpa was when it happened, because my dad, and my grandma all witnessed this, but my grandpa wasn't there. And she told me it was like Father's Day and that he was at the church. And so when we got off the phone, I just had this feeling to like search Father's Day 1991. And it was June 16th, 1991. And when I went and looked at my phone records, actually, the time when I called my mom and we had the 3-hour conversation ended up being June 16th. So 29 years to the day of that my uncle was killed, and I had no idea. So, yeah.
The power of words.
Yeah.
And
By the way, whenever I'm in France, if I see Americans, I steal their wallets. Just my little bit of reparations. Yeah, just a little reparations.
And it's really interesting that in Colbert's book, these really seminal things that happen in Lorraine's life, she describes them as the moment she became free. And so what I think people need to understand is that when you live in these bodies, right, people of color, when you're able to speak your truth in these different ways, it's freedom, right?
Absolutely.
It's liberating. So also in Radical Vision, Dr. Colbert reinterprets and portrays Lorraine Hansberry as a multi-layered author and activist whose role in the community and vision for our collective future was misunderstood in her time. She was relegated to a housewife who lucked up and wrote a great play, right? So none of her brilliance was assigned to her in her time. So are there female characters or influences in your work? And how do you portray them? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I mean, there are definitely female characters in my work. You know, my mom came to the United States first, and then sent for us kids. She was a single mom for a while there. And so my influences are women. You know, the person that I am, I give credit every day for the women that have been a part of my life. When my mom left us with my grandparents, and my grandmother was my heart. I mean, you know, my sensitivity. I mean, everything that I value that makes me a complete human being is because of the feminine influence in my life. And you know, coming from Caribbean parents, it's Caribbean society. It's also there's a lot of deep history, right? It comes from slavery and all these different things, and so there's a lot of Caribbean men that you see examples of them, and they're not always positive examples. So for me, I saw the fracturing of black men around me also, and I saw the strength in the women that were around me that actually kept the whole family unit going and you know, making sacrifices for the family. And so for me, in my paintings, there's a lot of women, and they're always in positive light. There's one painting that I did that was at the last show. It was called "I Concede the World to Women," and obviously, you know, during the pandemic and everything else, the countries that actually had the most success with COVID were run by women, and so I was like, you know what, we've had a good run at it, and so guys, don't get mad at me, but I said, you know, I conceded the world to women. So for me, yeah, the women in my paintings are very strong, very positive, and there's no me without them. So I recognize that. And even in my business, I mean, as successful as my restaurant is, without my wife, it's really wouldn't be the same. So those are the people that I paint.
You know, I think one thing I was reminded of in this book is how important it is to continue to remind ourselves about the ways in which women, in particular women of color, are sort of written out of history, and how important it is for us to try to write back in their contributions. And I note that because, you know, in this biography, time and time again, it's noted that that although Lorraine Hansberry is celebrated for her sort of well-known plays like, you know, Raising the Sun, all this writing she did for ladders, for freedom, for smaller publications that wasn't part of the mainstream media's narrative. And so people didn't know about her connection to the gay community during her time. They didn't know about her advocacy for third world revolution. They didn't know about a lot of her civil rights, her really radical civil rights work. They didn't know about her radical vision. And it was all because those parts of her history were written out of history. I was reminded of that again recently when we all watched the Oscars. And everyone loved Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I loved Jamie Lee Curtis. But that look on Viola Davis's face when she lost for a bigger movie and I think a richer role and a career that has been filled with better performances, she goes home with nothing. And when someone reviews the Wikipedia article or whatever about what happened that night, you'll see the list of the winners, and Viola Davis's name will not be among them. Her contributions to cinematic history will be sort of written out of history again. That happens again and again. It's always important for us to sort of call that out and recognize these contributions that may not be there in the official or mainstream narratives. But in terms of contributions of women to my own work, one thing that really sort of inspired me was some of my recent writing and really sort of motivated me is that a few years ago, my wife had a brain aneurysm, and I don't know if you've ever had a loved one that has had a brain aneurysm. It's a terrible, terrible malady that changes your life in many ways. I remember afterwards the doctor saying that the kind of aneurysm she had was a kind that about half the people who have it die from, and the half that survive maybe wish that they had. And so she had to learn how to sort of walk again and talk again, and it was a long sort of, and she's a TV reporter, so it was a long process to try to get back on the air again. She's now fully recovered, and she's actually back on the air. And and people who are on the outside can't even tell that there's been a difference, but it was a long process to get there. But the interesting part of the process is that she began to read romance fiction. She's very serious. I mean, she has degrees from Columbia and Harvard, and suddenly she just got really interested in romantic fiction because there's something about the simplicity in the directness of the stories that allowed her to sort of knit her brain back together by reading these stories. And so I began to buy a lot of romantic fiction for her. We have she was reading 2 or 3 of these books a week. We have shelves and shelves loaded with all these romantic writers, and they all have pictures of people groping each other on top of them. It's really kind of crazy, and yet the more and more she read them, the more and more it really sort of helped recharge her brain. And I found those fascinating because it just sort of showed the power of a story, regardless of the genre, regardless of whether it's a paperback or a hardcover or a bestseller or not a bestseller. Just the human act of telling a story can really help bring you back to yourself. And it sort of, again, reminded me just how important this task of telling each other stories really is on an individual level in terms of reknitting your brain, and also on a societal level where we tell each other stories to sort of relate to each other as human beings. Sometimes we meet people in books we'll never meet in real life and be able to relate to them more directly. That's why I think it's so important to write young people's literature, because then people can understand each other and maybe understand each other where we're coming from, and not have all these divides between us because we've walked in each other's shoes. And this whole experience sort of taught me that, or reminded me of that all the more.
Yeah, a lot of similarities for sure. Again, I think for me, 2 women in particular from my life really showed up strongly in my work, and I'll say one is my wife. I got married very young. I was 23 when we got married, and I remember, hopefully, being in love and getting married for the right reasons. But one of the things I loved about my then fiance girlfriend was how fiery and energetic and decisive she was. I didn't think about it at the time, but the ways in which she was quite the opposite to how I pictured my mom, who was always silent and quiet and didn't say a lot. I really like connected to this idea of like having a woman in my life that was like very strong and like would say what was on her mind. I think that comes through a lot in my work. And then as I was like going along, and my wife would tell me like anytime I talk to my mom on the phone, like it sounds like I'm holding my breath. And I was just like, first I was annoyed when she told me that because I was like, no, I don't do that. But then when I started, after she said it, I couldn't stop seeing myself doing it. I was like, dang it, she's right. And I think for me, there was this like idea of being afraid of hurting my mom, and specifically by like making her relive the trauma by bringing the stories back up. And in the process of finally talking to my mom and hearing more of the story, the untold portions, I was really able to see in an unassuming way how powerful my mom was in her silence. And by extension, my grandma for being able to move to like from the islands here by herself to bring her entire family like on her back and bring them here. And similarly, my mom being able to live through the moment of watching her brother die and to take me and my siblings and to have like the strength and the resilience to like move us someplace where we could be good and have that peace. And the idea of silence that can be like kind of traumatizing, but then also silence that can be like the strength that you need to get to a place where now I would say that my mom has empowered me to speak because she was able to hold us in that time. And so I would say those are like the two women that inform my work a ton.
So I want to ask, I think we've touched on this a bit already, but an idea that comes up in Colbert's book is the idea of double consciousness, which really harkens back to W.E.B. Du Bois and his thinking about how Black people see themselves as both Black and American at the same time. And I'm wondering, Hansberry talks about looking at yourselves through the eyes of others. And I'm just wondering how, when you're creating in your art, how the various facets of your identity show up. How do you see yourself? What parts of yourself are on display through your work? Devin, I'm looking right at you, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a, I think, very great question. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and so I was surrounded by a ton of whiteness, and can remember when I first moved to this place, not understanding at all what race was. Like, to me, I had come from a place where there was like, in Miami, there was like a lot of Black people, but there was like a lot of Hispanics. And the idea of like being other was not something that was familiar to me until I found myself on the playground and the other kids being afraid of me. And that was like really jarring for me. And so I think initially when I started off on this particular book, the idea of like race and the ways in which and almost to like the bluest eye of it all. Like I was like thinking of like how I'm going to project this at the other person, and actually was reflected in the like title of my book. It was called Human Like You. And it was portion of like how I need to learn to be like a human, but then also like I want the other person to see me as a human on the other end. And I think it was a lot of listening to probably like Toni Morrison, who talked about like what she felt was right to show up in the like space of like, I think what she called get whitey books. There was a lot of authors who used to write these like get whitey books that were like directed at like white people and the things that they needed to do, and that she couldn't do that and she didn't want to do that, and instead to think of like what is her existence from her own perspective. And so I think that was kind of how my work type of shifted a bit as it relates to like how I see myself from other people's eyes, but then how I'm able to like see myself from my own eyes and the things that I've done to myself and to my sons and to my wife and to my family, and to not write out the hardships that were and the racism that is, but to think of like, where's the accountability for me in this, so that I can get to a place of freedom. Even if nobody else changes, I can be free.
You know, I once saw this really interesting research about the way in which people sort of estimate height. And if researchers ask you to estimate some passerby's height, how much taller they are than 5 feet. Generally, you'll say, oh, they're 5'3", 5'4". But if you say, tell us how tall they are based on how much shorter they are under 6 feet, it'll be closer to 6 feet. You'll say like 5'10" or 5'11". It'll be higher. And what that tells you is that baseline that people give you will influence your opinion. And I say that because I try to never have someone else's baseline affect what I'm doing. And I try to ignore what the sort of non-black mainstream may or may not think of my work, because I don't want to have my estimation be pushed up or pushed down based on the baseline they're giving me. I think that's a challenge for sort of every sort of writer or artist to sort of separate themselves out from that baseline the mainstream is trying to give us. I've always thought the idea of double consciousness is really dangerous. It kind of reminds me of doublethink in 1984 in Orwell, where you're trying to hold these two competing ideas in your head simultaneously, and you're sort of living in a fantasy world. Trying to imagine yourself in your own shoes, and also trying to imagine the way white people may see you, again, pulls your baseline, pulls you away from yourself, and can affect your work in really kind of negative ways. And I've seen it happen within my own family. I remember one of my brothers, when he was young, living in Brockport, New York. I remember teachers coming to my parents saying, "We think he needs to be in the learning disabled class." And we're like, I remember my parents saying, we don't think that's really the case. And of course, it wasn't really true. The learning disabled class was mostly people of color. And he went on to, go to UVA and go and graduate from Harvard Law School. So their estimation of where he was, their baseline, was completely off from the reality. And so when I write my books, I'm always trying to think. I'm trying to separate myself off from what the mainstream is thinking and just thinking my own terms. And I found a lot when I was a music critic for Time magazine. A lot of the great artists I talked to, that's how they saw the world. I mean, when I talked to Joni Mitchell, when I talked to Bob Dylan, when I talked to Lauryn Hill, all of their artistic vision was very singular. They didn't care what I had to say about their work. They didn't care what others had to say about their work. They're doing their own thing. They often didn't even read the reviews, and I think they were telling the truth about that. They just wanted to do their own thing and not worry about what anyone else had to say, and that's why their work has stood the test of time. And I think that's what we all have to do, is sort of get away from double consciousness and really get into our own singular consciousness and not let the baseline take us away from who we are.
For me, it's a bit of a more complicated story, because coming from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, where I was born, and in the area that I actually lived in, and when I was a much younger person, is that it was very diverse. I mean, I played with English kids, I played with East Indian kids, African kids, but we were all Trinidadians. So that experience for me was like, when I came to the United States, was really one of the first times that I really ever had to kind of confront race. And it wasn't really, it wasn't a devastating thing for me, because my consciousness was not like, if somebody didn't like me, it wasn't race-based. That was not the first thing that I thought about, because that's not the life that I kind of grew up in. And in Trinidad, you got to be where you are by proving yourself to be who you are. You get educated, you get a job, you become president, you can become doctors, whatever, and it's your work ethics that comes along. However, as an artist, I do find that I do consider my audience, only because some of the things that I'm willing to talk about and say are sensitive things. And again, in order to create the conversation, you have to be careful of the words that you choose to have a conversation. If I come in and I'm aggressive, the conversation's going to end. I'm not going to be able to reach that person. So I'm very cautious about, and I think in my consciousness, okay, who's my audience, what am I trying to say to them, and how can I reach them, considering that they already have preconceived notions of whatever life has brought to them. And so, but the one thing that I will say, and Chris touched upon it, once I decide that this is the way that I choose to say what I'm saying, it doesn't really matter either what anyone else thinks about it, because that's the choice that I've made as an artist, and I stick by that choice. And so it comes in because the conversation, how do I want the conversation to go? But what I need to say is not compromised by what the other person might choose or think.
Thank you. Baldwin from Sweet Lorraine said, art had a purpose and its purpose was action. It contained an energy that could change things. What impact do you think visual art and writing have on people's lived experiences and on our politics?
Looking at me.
You can start.
You have 5 minutes.
Time's up. It's really interesting. I think it is something that is very powerful, can be dangerous, depending on the things that are like shared or banned from being shared. And I think specifically to Baldwin, a couple years ago, or maybe it was before the pandemic, there was an art installation that opened by Glenn Liken in the city in Manhattan. And my wife invited me and my sons to go, and oftentimes when she likes to go to the places, it's usually places that I don't necessarily like to go to. And my older son especially, museums, art, installations, no, he doesn't want to go at all. And so I looked it up though online. I was like, no, this seems like an interesting one. And we got there, and right off the bat, there was on the bottom floor, there was these neon lights making these words. And my son was just ready to go on to the next thing. I was like, no, let's stop and read this. And it turned out that the words were Trinidadian based, the sound that we make in our culture, chips. And I think for one of the first times at the art installations and the museums that we had gone to, a portion of our identity was found there. And as we went to each floor, there was another layer of us that we saw. And I think we got on the top floor, and it was James Baldwin's piece, Strangers in the Village Strangers. He talks about, it's a piece about when he was traveling in Europe and seeing people treat him differently based on his blackness. Sometimes people would be curious, sometimes people would think suspicious. And I was relaying to my son that that had happened to us. We had gone to Vietnam, and at the time he was maybe 4 and our younger son was 6 months. And we had gone around this lake in Hanoi, and one of the people had walked up to me and basically interviewed us. And we had a back and forth conversation. She was super curious. And at the end she was like, it's just thank you for talking to me. You're the very first person I'd ever seen with your skin complexion. And that was really profound to me, because I grew up in America where anytime there was the difference was bad, something that was let me stay away from you. And being able to see that moment of the difference was just something to, I'm curious. And the two of us were asking questions of each other, and to be able to have that moment and relay that back to my son with Baldwin's piece was just all the ways in which we were represented in this space. And I think it informed our existence and our lived experience in the ways in which there's probably more to the story than if you were just looking at the surface level of what it means to be a black person. There's a lot more to it than just the color of our skin, and the depths that we can have from culture and connections to my Caribbean roots that I wouldn't otherwise have seen if I hadn't had a chance to see that art, I think.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I think that art is really the most powerful force in the world. I think it's more powerful than nuclear fusion or viruses or politics. And in the biography, I think that there's this one passage I think was really striking about how, in order to sort of get a message through to the culture, things have to work in tandem. You have to have the artists working on things. You have to have politicians working on things, and the messages have to be delivered to the public in tandem, or they probably won't land. Because just giving someone facts and figures doesn't necessarily make them want to take action. We all saw that during the pandemic. People knew the virus was deadly. They knew that things like inoculations and masks could help, but without a story to anchor what was going on, all these facts and figures and numbers and statistics, it was meaningless. People were going to do what they wanted to do. They needed to have a story to sort of make them take action. And that's where art comes in. Art fills in the gap and says, here's the story behind this. Here's the emotion. Here's what ties us all together and might want to make you take action. And I remember growing up, there was a book that really reminded me and first signaled that to me in terms of the power of a good story to sort of unite people into taking action. And that book was the book Roots by Alex Haley. When it came out in approximately in the mid 1970s, talking about slavery was something that was sort of a forbidden subject. Talking about Black Americans talking about their connection to the past and white Americans talking about their culpability in that past was something that wasn't much in the public square. But because that story was so powerful and the resulting miniseries was so powerful, to this day you have shows like Finding Your Roots by Henry Louis Gates, where people want to look back and explore, well, what is my connection? Do I have any slaveholders or slaves enslaved people in the family? What's going on? And it completely sort of changed the game in terms of America's relationship to its own history, and that all happened in the pages of a book. A great artist, a great writer managed to capture that story and make us take action about our own history. So I think that art plays an incredibly important role just in human motivation and in changing the culture. And I think about the responsibility every time I write a book. Will this move the needle? Can I express myself in a way that makes sense and that really acknowledges the power of art?
I agree with both of you gentlemen. For me, I think it's such a powerful tool in such a way. Words, of course, they say words are powerful, right? So that's why I think for me as a visual artist, I tend to kind of like be very measured in what I do, because I think it's going to be, even in a time when I'm not here, somebody could look back on what I've done and say, you know what, this is what was going on at this time. I think it also talks to the past, it talks about now, and it also lends to the future. I know one of the most powerful paintings that I've ever seen. It was very simple. It was basically, I was in the Marais in Paris, and in a Jewish restaurant, there was a painting on the wall, which I could see it right now. It was just like gray and black colors, and there was a barbed wire fence across the painting, and there was just a drip of blood. And just that one painting, I mean, I'm talking about it now, and the hair on my body stood up, because the power of that simple painting, and it was no more than this size, was so profound to me. And so that's why I think that, people in the arts, what they do and what they say is very important. And I had a gentleman say to me one time, the purpose of art is to create communication. Somebody might have a brick on a wall, and one person's going to come up and say, what the heck is that? And somebody else would speak to them in a certain way, and they would have conversation. And being human is having conversation. And so the power of art through those simple things, whatever someone does, is by somebody's definition, it's going to have some meaning. So I think it's really a powerful tool.
Nicole, should we take questions now? Is it time?
To do that. I could sit here forever and listen. Is this on? Okay, check. Hello. So does anyone have a question for any of our panelists? Yeah.
Hi. Is this even on? Okay.
It's for the people online.
It's on. She says it's
Oh, they're picking it up? Okay. I'll make sure I speak loud for people in the back. I've really been enjoying hearing all of you guys speak about your experiences. And as you guys have been talking about your artistry, and I've also been thinking about where we are in society. And, you know, Nicole knows this. I'm writing a book on racism. My book will be like the band kind of book. But I'm curious to know, in this landscape of where there is banning taking place, and you guys are all artists, how do you see your work, you know, fitting in or not fitting in to this shifting landscape that's rejecting people's artistry?
I desperately want people to ban my book. Please ban my book, 0 o'clock, Game World, around Harvard Square. Please ban it, because, yeah, I think it's a bump in sales. I think it allows you to talk about issues that are important. So I really want, I hope Harrison Library for this just pulls it from the shelves. It's dangerous. It's bad for kids. Please burn it in the parking lot. If that happens, I'll be the happiest artist ever.
No, I think, you know, I'm sure, like, definitely my political art would be burned in Florida. So, no, but I think it's really dangerous what's happening. But I think regardless of what people do, as long as they're artists living and being true to themselves and to, you know, reporting what they see, one thing would be banned, but there would always be somebody to kind of like talk about what's going on and still have the relevancy of it. So, you know, banning books and doing all the different things, I don't think it's going to silence people. I think it's going to make people much more curious, especially the younger people these days, I think. If you tell them they can't do it, I think that's what they're going to try and get. So I think it's crazy that it's happening, and it really affects me as a person in general, because sometimes you just feel powerless about it. But I think as an artist, you still have to keep doing what you do and hope that it gets out there.
And I think for me, as much as obviously for sales, you know, great for the author and the sales of their book, but I think it's for me really devastating thinking about art. Art to me is like truth. And so like if you're banning truth, you're not having an opportunity to really explore that part of like human experience. And I think even working within like this trauma space, I think a lot of people are like fearful of like, I want to have a fun and book that's like filled with laughter. And for me, trauma and looking at it and going back in and looking at it again and revising and like having an opportunity to return to it over and over allows for people to grow. And so anytime that somebody's banning something and rejecting someone else's truth, it's actually hurting them more than it's hurting anyone else. Like they don't have an opportunity then to, even just like the Ruby Bridges thing that just happened recently, I think the idea of like, this isn't good for, let's have something that's nice and pleasant, is actually taking them away from what's good for them as people and the experiences that we can get and learn from seeing like these truths and accepting truth as truth.
You know, and one important thing to remember is that there's never been a case in history where book banning has been vindicated by the passage of time. We don't look back and go like, oh, wasn't it a good idea for them to have banned Catcher in the Rye? Boy, what a good call that was. That's never happened. So people who are now sort of pulling books from shelves should realize it never works out well for them. At some point, they'll be talking to their grandkids, and they'll go like, were you the one who was behind banning The Bluest Eye? You know, what was up with that? And they'll have to explain to their grandkids, yeah, I was the one who did that, because at no time, and we can look back for the last 100 years, at no time was there a book that we now look back and go like, boy, good call to burn that one. Really good idea to crush those Beatles albums in the parking lot. It never works out.
I too enjoyed you gentlemen, and I want to thank you all because you let me know how free I am. I didn't realize it until tonight. And I was curious now that you are moving towards that freedom, do you regret that self-imprisonment prior?
That's a really good question.
Can you say the end of that? I didn't quite catch that. Do you regret what?
Regret the self-imprisonment because you impose those things on yourself, you know, like you're considering, oh, this woman's gonna be nervous, me walking behind her, you know, like I never cared about that, you know, so I just realized that I was free and
Yeah.
how free I am, and I was wondering now that in your case, you have like decided to claim your freedom, and I got that influence from you as well. So I was wondering, do you regret making that sacrifice, which you kind of imprisoned yourself, you know what I mean? So I was wondering if there was any regret.
You know, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it's regretful, only because my life has been good. I've had a great life. I've been very blessed with a lot of things. And I think a lot of things that I actually have had has because of the person that I had been and still continue to be. So I think, you know, it's kind of been of late, right? That whole new transformation. And I think in a way, because we're human beings and we still care about other people's feelings, I think, you know, it's measured in a way right now, but there's still, there is a freedom. I don't know if I would say that I regret it, but I wish I had the knowledge, you know, to actually have handled it in a different way back then. And I think because of my upbringing and where I was from had a lot to do with how I respond to that. So a lot of the burden of that wasn't really kind of on me. It was just like something that I inherited, and it might have been, you know, the history of colonialism or whatever it is. You know, we are, you know, the sum of all of our experiences, right? And so I think that was a learning thing. And I think there's some instances where you're going to get into and you need to be measured. And, you know, but you should know why you're being measured and if there's a alternative goal to what you're trying to achieve to be in that space. So that's kind of how I see it.
Well, yeah, I always think of what Bob Marley said, you know, none but ourselves can free our minds. So, you know, these prisons you're talking about, of course, you know, they don't exist, and they can be transcended. And I'm also thinking of the line from the biography about how, you know, freedom isn't a destination, really is a journey. There's no point where you can go like, oh, I'm totally free. That should be something you think about all the time. You're continually refining and fighting for your freedom. If you think you're free, you're probably in prison. You've got to keep on fighting because there's always going to be some challenge, whether it's someone trying to ban your book or some other attack on you of someone trying to stop you from embracing that freedom. So it's a constant struggle. I always think of free is a verb and not an adjective. It's a verb. It's something you're constantly in the process of fighting. And one of the note on the whole imprisonment thing, again, you know, to me, I've never felt imprisoned as an artist because I just know that prisons have no power. You know, again, I think of Malcolm X, who, you know, found himself in prison. I think of Mandela, who helped, you know, destroy apartheid while in prison. I think of the Apostle Paul, who helped, you know, found Christianity in prison. You know, whenever people seek to imprison people, in the end, the prison empowers the people they're trying to imprison. And we've seen that time and time again throughout history. So as an artist, you know, again, I say bring on book banning, bring on people trying to put your work behind bars. It only strengthens what you're doing. It only fuels your resolve. And because the only one who can, you know, again, as Bob Marley said, can really sort of imprison you is yourself.
Well, perhaps I should have phrased it now that you are a freedom fighter. It was, I was talking about self-imposed. I'm not talking about
Okay.
but I appreciate that.
Either way.
It was enlightening.
Either way, they're not stopping you, man. Either way.
I think for me, I don't know if I would use the word regret, though something very adjacent to. I do feel from time to time and probably go into these periods of like blaming myself. I'll blame myself and I'll get really down on myself, especially when I think of like, I wanted to be a father from like the time I was like maybe like 9 or 10 years old. Had like visualized holding my child and like protecting and loving and like to be the person who ended up hurting them in the end, I think was really hard for me to like face. And I had a lot of regret as it relates to like, if I had learned this earlier, I would not have. But at the same time, I was 6 years old when this happened. So I think there's periods where I'll go into like blaming my parents, like why didn't they do this and that? And through hearing their stories and like knowing the more to it, it's like I can't blame them either. Like my mom had to have her parents leave her in the islands and come to a place where people thought she was speaking French because of her strong accent and would make fun of her in Brooklyn, and grew up in a really tough place. And so then I'll blame America and I'll go in these like cycles of like going around. And I think as I like move through that and go towards not a destination, but the journey of freedom, I think I really appreciate what the journey has been and what me having held this silence for so long means for other people. For somebody out there, I know that there's someone else who has something that they need to say. And if I hadn't gone through this and held it for so long, like me sharing wouldn't have the same impact. If they saw someone who was standing up on the stage and they're just freely saying whatever they want and they're like confident, it's different than somebody who's like, oh no, I was running from this for forever. And if I faced it, like absolutely anybody else can too.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to have all of you here. And I have to say, you're all amazing, amazing speakers. Also, it's very touching to have young kids here. And for an hour and a half, they were listening and behaving amazingly. And we had middle schoolers and high schoolers, and kids participated and produced art and videos. So, and I think the whole idea of hosting events like that it will be all your wisdom, ideas passed to next generation. So my question is, like, in a couple words, what is your message to these kids about activism, art, and freedom?
Thank you, Galina. That's how we'll end it, because that's a good one.
Yeah, everybody's thinking of their 2 words.
I can say for me, I don't know if it's going to come out in a couple of words, but I think, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but how much my sons teach me. And so first, the idea of like, you have agency and power already, that you don't need anybody's permission to show up in the world. And probably the one word I would use is expression. And art, I think, is a form of expression and is a form of freedom for me. So express yourself in whatever form of art you can find.
I would say, be yourself, be your authentic self. And, if creating is what really moves you, just do that. Because for me, if I had the choice to just do one thing, it would be creating my art. And I think once you put your true passion into it, somebody will connect with whatever you're trying to do.
I would say, fight the power. And I say that because I think so often, especially in the U.S., I think when you combine art with social activism, is seen as somehow cheapening the art. Oh, the art should be about these transcendent things, it should be about just truth and beauty. I see activism and truth and beauty as inseparable. I think the world isn't beautiful without activism in it. And so I would say make sure your art is sending a message, trying to change things, trying to get your truth out there, trying to give a voice to the voiceless. And if you do that, if your art really is engaging with the world as it is in a real way, I think then you're doing something.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here. It's so great to be in person again. I want to thank Devin Sandiford, Leslie Gaskin, Christopher, John Farley, Candace Pinn, Alvin Clayton, and Ann Lobu. I want to thank the Westchester County Board of Legislators who funds Five Towns, One Book, the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition who inspired us with Dr. Suika Degas-Colbert's book, Radical Vision. And I do want to say that this evening was very humbling for me. We've been at this since 2018, and we're nothing without the generosity of people like this. So thank you.